Movies make history look so glamorous, but the truth, it was cold, dark, and exhausting. Come closer, see the harsh reality. Let this draw you in. Step back in time to a quiet castle kitchen. A young servant tends to the hearth's embers. Smoke rises gently by the frosted window.
Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere you might not expect. Not to a grand hall or a battlefield, but to the heart of the castle. The kitchen. And not just any kitchen, but a medieval kitchen in the depths of winter. Forget the cozy hearth scenes you've seen in movies. Forget the jolly cook stirring a pot while snow falls gently outside. The reality was smoke, ice, darkness, and exhaustion. It was a place where servants worked until their hands cracked and bled, where fires had to burn constantly, or people would starve, and where the cold seeped through stone walls no matter how large the flames grew. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy what we do here. And subscribe if you'd like more of these stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's listening from across the world. Now, get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Pull your blanket a little higher. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Tonight, we're stepping back 700 years into a kitchen that never slept, where winter was not a season of rest, but a test of endurance. Let's begin. The kitchen was always the first place to wake up. Hours before dawn, before the Lord stirred in his bedchamber, before the guards on the night watch were relieved, the kitchen was already alive with movement and the smell of smoke. Winter mornings were the worst. The fire in the main hearth never went completely out, but by the early hours it had diminished to embers. The first task of the day belonged to the scullion, usually the youngest servant in the kitchen, sometimes no more than 8 or 9 years old. Their job was to rebuild the fire. The stone floor was cold enough to numb your feet through worn leather shoes. Your breath came out in clouds that hung in the air. The kitchen, despite its massive fireplace, was not a warm place at this hour. Heat rose and escaped through the high ceiling or the gaps around the shuttered windows. What remained was a bone-deep chill that made your fingers stiff and clumsy. The scullion would kneel by the hearth, careful not to disturb the remaining coals too much. Kindling had been prepared the night before, small dry sticks and strips of bark, kept in a basket near the fire to stay dry. You would arrange these carefully over the embers, leaning in close, sometimes too close, until your face felt hot and your eyes stung from the smoke. Then you would blow. Gently at first, then more insistently. The embers would glow brighter, orange turning to white at the edges. Sometimes they would catch, sometimes they would not. On particularly cold mornings, when frost had crept into everything, you might kneel there for a quarter of an hour, blowing until you felt dizzy, before the kindling finally caught and small flames began to lick upward. Once the kindling was burning, you would add larger pieces of wood. Not too quickly, or you would smother what you had started. The wood had been brought in the night before and stacked near the hearth. But winter wood was often damp. It would hiss and pop as the flames touched it, releasing steam and smoke in equal measure. The smoke was always present. It rose from the fire and spread through the kitchen, hanging at eye level before slowly drifting upward toward the lavas in the ceiling. These were openings designed to let smoke escape, but they were never quite adequate. On calm days, the smoke would linger. On windy days, it would swirl and eddy, sometimes even pushing back down into the room. Your eyes would water. Your throat would feel raw. By the end of a day in the kitchen, everyone's clothes and hair would smell of wood smoke so strongly that it became part of them. Visitors could always identify kitchen servants by scent alone. As the fire grew, other servants began to arrive. The kitchen operated in a strict hierarchy, and everyone knew their place. The head cook, if the household was large enough to employ one, would appear soon after the fire was established. Below them were assistant cooks, pastry makers, spit turners, servers, and at the bottom, the scullions who cleaned and fetched and performed the endless small tasks no one else wanted to do. In winter, there was an urgency to the morning work. The household needed to be fed, and food in winter required more time and effort to prepare than in the warmer months. Nothing was fresh. Nothing was easy. The first meal of the day was not the grand affair you might imagine. For most people in a castle, breakfast was a simple matter. Bread, perhaps some ale or weak beer, maybe a piece of cold meat or cheese. But even simple food required preparation. Bread was baked in advance, sometimes every few days, depending on the size of the household. In winter, the bakehouse was one of the few places that stayed genuinely warm, thanks to the bread ovens. These were massive stone structures, heated by burning wood inside them until the stones themselves were hot enough to bake bread from residual heat. The process took hours, but bread went stale quickly in the cold, damp air. By the second day, it was hard. By the third, it could barely be bitten into. It was sometimes soaked in ale or broth to soften it, or used as a trencher, a thick slice that served as both plate and food. The trencher would absorb the juices and fats from whatever was placed on it, and at the end of the meal, it would be eaten by servants or given to the poor. Ale was brewed regularly because water was not considered safe to drink on its own. Ale was weak, usually only a few % alcohol, and was consumed by everyone from children to the elderly. It was filling, mildly nutritious, and safer than the alternative. Brewing was a task that happened continuously, with large barrels always in various stages of fermentation in the cool cellars below the kitchen. But in winter, the cellar was not just cool, it was freezing. Servants who had to fetch ale or supplies from below would wrap themselves in extra layers before descending the narrow stone stairs. The barrels were heavy, the stairs were slippery. More than one servant ended their career or their life by falling on those stairs. The main work of the kitchen, though, was preparing the midday and evening meals. These were more elaborate, especially for the noble family and their guests. And in winter, this meant working with ingredients that had been preserved, stored, or otherwise kept from spoiling since the harvest months. There was no fresh fruit. No fresh vegetables beyond what had been stored in root cellars. Apples and pears that had been carefully wrapped and placed in cool, dark spaces. Onions and turnips and carrots buried in sand or straw to keep them from rotting. Cabbage that had been salted or fermented. Everything tasted of preservation, of age, of making do. Meat was a different challenge entirely. Animals were slaughtered in the autumn, before winter set in, and feeding them became impossible. The meat had to last for months. Some of it was salted, packed in barrels with coarse salt until it was hard and nearly inedible without extensive soaking and cooking. Some was smoked, hung in smokehouses until it turned dark and leathery. Some was made into sausages, The meat mixed with fat and spices and stuffed into casings. None of it was fresh. All of it required work to make edible. Salted meat had to be soaked in water, sometimes for a full day, to remove enough salt that it wouldn't make you ill. The water had to be changed several times. Then the meat had to be boiled, often for hours, until it was tender enough to chew. The resulting broth was salty and greasy, but it was nutritious, and it formed the base for many winter meals. Smoked meat was easier in some ways, but it was also tougher and required long, slow cooking. It would be added to pots of stew or pottage, contributing flavor and protein to dishes that were otherwise mostly grain and root vegetables. The heart of the medieval kitchen, literally and figuratively, was the great fireplace. These were not the modest hearths of later centuries. They were massive structures, sometimes 12 feet wide or more, large enough that a person could stand inside them without crouching. They were built of stone and designed to accommodate multiple pots, spits, and cooking vessels at once. The fireplace burned constantly in winter. Letting it go out was not just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. Starting a fire from nothing was difficult and time-consuming, requiring flint and steel and tinder and patience. Most households kept their fires burning day and night, rather than face the prospect of rekindling them each morning. This meant that someone always had to tend the fire. Wood had to be added regularly. Coals had to be arranged to create the right heat in different areas. It was skilled work, knowing how to maintain the fire at the correct intensity for different cooking tasks. Near the fire stood the spit turner. This was usually a young boy or a servant of low rank. Their job was simple in concept but exhausting in practice. Large pieces of meat, when they were available, were roasted on spits, long metal rod that passed through the meat and rested on supports over the fire. The spit had to be turned constantly to cook the meat evenly and prevent it from burning. Turning a spit was tedious work. You stood close to the fire for hours, one hand on the wooden handle of the spit, turning it at a steady pace. The heat was intense on the side facing the fire. The cold pressed against your back. You would sweat and shiver at the same time. Your arm would ache. Your attention would wander. And if you stopped turning, even for a minute, the meat would begin to burn on one side and remain raw on the other. In larger households, they sometimes used a spit dog. This was a dog trained to run inside a wheel, like a hamster in a cage. And the wheel was connected to the spit by a chain or belt. The dog's movement would turn the spit automatically. It was clever, but it was also cruel. The dogs were kept in cramped wheels for hours, running in place in the heat and smoke. Other cooking vessels hung from chains or sat on trivets over different parts of the fire. Large iron pots, some of them so heavy it took 2 people to move them when full, bubbled with stews and pottages. These were the staple meals of winter. Thick, hot, filling. A mixture of whatever was available. Grains like barley or oats, root vegetables, perhaps some meat if there was any to spare, herbs for flavor, salt for preservation and taste. Pottage was eaten by everyone, from the lowest servant to the noble family, though the quality varied considerably. The servant's pottage was thin, mostly grain and water with perhaps an onion or 2. The noble's pottage was richer, thickened with meat and fat, seasoned with imported spices that most people would never taste in their lifetimes. Spices were luxury items in winter. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. They came from distant lands, carried by merchants over dangerous routes, and they were expensive beyond the means of ordinary people. They were stored carefully, measured out in tiny quantities, used to flavor the food of the wealthy. For everyone else, flavor came from whatever herbs had been dried during the harvest. Thyme, sage, rosemary, if you were fortunate. Often, though, winter food was simply bland. The smoke in the kitchen was at its worst when cooking was in full progress. Multiple fires, multiple pots, steam rising from boiling water and roasting meat. The air became thick enough that you could barely see from one side of the room to the other. Your eyes would stream, your throat would burn, and yet you had to keep working. There was no choice. Water was another constant challenge in a medieval kitchen. Especially in winter, castle usually had a well, either in the courtyard or sometimes even within the castle walls, if the builders had been fortunate enough to find a water source during construction. But wells froze in winter, or at least the surface of the water froze, and drawing water became harder. The well was often deep. The bucket would descend on a rope, hand over hand, until you heard the splash far below. Then you would pull it back up, and in winter the rope would be stiff and cold, and your hands would be numb even through gloves. The bucket, when it finally reached the top, would be heavy and awkward to maneuver. Water splashed easily, and spilled water on stone steps quickly turned to ice. Water was needed for everything. Washing vegetables, soaking meat, boiling grains, cleaning pots and dishes, extinguishing small fires when embers fell from the hearth. A large household might use dozens of buckets of water each day, and in winter, fetching it was miserable work. Sometimes, when the well was frozen solid, or the water level had dropped too low, servants would have to melt snow or ice. This was inefficient and frustrating. You would fill pots with snow and place them near the fire, and the snow would melt down to almost nothing. It took enormous quantities of snow to produce even a small amount of water, and the water was cold and had to be heated again before it could be used for cooking. Washing dishes was its own ordeal. There was no soap as we know it. Instead, they used sand or ashes to scour pots, scrubbing with rough cloths or handfuls of straw until their hands were raw. In winter, the water for washing was cold unless you heated it, which required more fuel and more time. Often, dishes were simply rinsed quickly and left to dry near the fire, where they would steam and smell faintly of whatever had been cooked in them last. The drainage of wastewater was primitive. There might be a stone trough or drain that led outside, but it often froze in winter, backing up and creating pools of filthy water on the kitchen floor. The floor itself was usually packed earth or, in wealthier castles, stone. Either way, it was cold and damp and unpleasant to stand on for long periods. Servants wore wooden clogs or wrapped their feet in extra rags to keep warm. But it was never enough. Rats were common in kitchens. They were attracted by the food and the warmth of the fire. You would see them darting along the walls, hear them scratching in the straw that was sometimes spread on the floor. Cats were kept to control them, but the rats were bold and numerous. Food had to be stored carefully, hung from hooks, or kept in sealed containers, or the rats would get to it first. The hierarchy in the kitchen was strict and unforgiving. At the top was the head cook, if the household employed one. This was a position of some prestige, relatively speaking. a skilled cook could earn a reasonable wage and might even have a small private space to sleep rather than bedding down with the other servants. The head cook was responsible for planning meals, managing supplies, directing the other servants, and ensuring that food was prepared to the Lord's satisfaction. It was a demanding role, requiring not just cooking skill, but also the ability to stretch limited resources through the long winter months. Below the head cook were assistant cooks and specialists. A pastry cook, if the household was large enough. Someone responsible for sauces. Someone who managed the roasting. In smaller households, 1 or 2 people might do all of these tasks. Then came the scullions. These were the lowest rank in the kitchen, often children or young teenagers. They did the work no one else wanted, fetching water, cleaning out the fireplaces and removing ashes, scrubbing pots, turning spits, plucking feathers from birds, gutting fish. Their hands were always dirty, their clothes always stained, their bodies always tired. Scullions slept wherever there was space, often on the kitchen floor near the dying fire, wrapped in a thin blanket or a piece of old sacking. The floor was hard and cold, but at least it was near warmth. In the depths of winter, servants from other parts of the castle might try to slip into the kitchen at night, hoping to sleep near the fire. But they would be driven out if they were caught. Space near the hearth was precious, reserved for those who worked there. The kitchen day began before dawn and did not end until long after sunset. The evening meal had to be served, and then there was cleaning to be done, preparations for the next day, restocking of supplies. By the time a kitchen servant finally lay down to sleep, they might have been on their feet for 16 hours or more. And the next day, it would begin again. Food storage was a science and an art in medieval times, especially in winter when nothing fresh was available. Every castle had a series of storage areas, each designed for different types of provisions. The batteries stored ale and other beverages. The name came from the barrels, or butts, in which ale was stored. It was usually a cool, dark room, sometimes partially underground. The constant temperature helped keep the ale from spoiling, though it never stayed fresh for long. Ale had to be consumed within a few weeks of brewing, which meant that brewing was a continuous process. The pantry stored bread and dry goods, flour, oats, barley, dried peas and beans, salt, maybe some precious sugar if the household could afford it. Bread was stacked on shelves, growing harder each day. Grain was kept in large wooden chests or barrels, though mice and weevils were constant problems. You learned to sift grain before using it, picking out the insects and their droppings. The larder stored meat and fish, salted meat in barrels, smoked meat hanging from hooks, dried fish, hard as wood, that had to be soaked and beaten to make it edible. The larder was deliberately kept cold, which in winter was not difficult. Sometimes, in the coldest months, the entire room would be freezing, and the salted meat would be frozen solid, requiring time near the fire to thaw before it could even be cut. Root cellars stored vegetables. Potatoes did not yet exist in medieval Europe, but there were turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions, beets. These were layered in sand or straw, kept in the dark, checked regularly for rot. When a vegetable began to spoil, it had to be removed immediately, or it would spread to the others. By late winter, even the best stored vegetables were soft and sprouting, barely edible, but still used because there was nothing else. Apples and pears were wrapped individually, and stored in cool, dark places. They did not last as well as root vegetables. By midwinter, most were mushy or spoiled, though the good ones were carefully saved for the noble family. Cheese was stored in cool places and would last for months, growing harder and drier over time. By late winter, cheese was often so hard it had to be grated rather than sliced. Everything was rationed carefully. The steward, who managed the castle's supplies, would keep records of what was stored and how much was used each day. In a hard winter, when supplies ran low, portions were reduced. Servants ate less so that the noble family could maintain their standard of living. This was not cruelty, exactly, but simply the way things were. The hierarchy was everything, and survival was not guaranteed for anyone. The daily rhythms of the kitchen revolved around the needs of the household, but also around the limitations of winter light. Days were short. The sun rose late and set early. And the kitchen, with its small windows, was a dark place even at midday. Candles were expensive. They were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, or from beeswax if the household was wealthy. Tallow candles smelled terrible when they burned, a thick, greasy odor that added to the general unpleasantness of the kitchen. Beeswax candles smelled better, but were too costly for everyday use. They were reserved for the Lord's chambers and the chapel. Instead, the kitchen relied primarily on firelight. The great hearth provided light as well as heat, but it was not a steady or even light. Shadows jumped and flickered. Tasks that required precision, like cutting meat or measuring ingredients, were difficult in the dim, moving light. Rushlights were sometimes used as well. These were rushes, the stems of marsh plants, that had been soaked in fat and then dried. They would burn slowly, providing a small, weak light. They were cheaper than candles, but also messier, dripping fat and requiring a holder. Working in darkness or near darkness was simply accepted. Your eyes adjusted over time. You learned to work by feel as much as by sight. The experienced cook could tell when meat was done by touch, could judge the thickness of a sauce by the way it moved, could slice vegetables with steady, even strokes in light too dim to see clearly. But the darkness made everything slower. Mistakes were more common. A knife might slip in the dimness. Fingers might brush against a hot pot. A servant might trip over something unseen on the floor. Small injuries were constant, and they often became infected in the dirty, unsanitary conditions. There was no such thing as a day off in the medieval kitchen. Meals had to be prepared every day, regardless of religious festivals, illness, or exhaustion. On holy days, the Lord might feast, which meant even more work for the kitchen. On fast days, when meat was forbidden and only fish and vegetables were allowed, the work was different but no less demanding. The cold was the defining feature of winter in a medieval kitchen, as it was everywhere in the castle. But the cold in the kitchen was strange and uneven. Near the fire, you could be uncomfortably hot, sweating even as frost glittered on the windows. But a few steps away, the cold reasserted itself, seeping up through the floor and down from the high ceiling. Kitchen servants learned to layer clothing, though they owned very little. A rough wool tunic, perhaps a second one over the first. A vest or jerkin if they were fortunate. An apron, always stained and grimy, that protected their clothing from the worst of the kitchen work. Strips of cloth wrapped around their hands when handling hot pots, though these offered little protection against real heat. Feet were a constant problem. The cold floor drained the warmth from your body no matter how many layers you wore. Chilblains were common, painful swelling of the toes and fingers from exposure to cold. Once you had them, they returned every winter, itching and burning whenever you went from cold to warmth. The head cook might have boots, but most kitchen servants made do with shoes that were thin and worn, held together with stitching and hope. When it snowed, and snow was tracked into the kitchen, the floor became wet and even colder. You learned to keep moving, to shift your weight from foot to foot, to take any excuse to stand near the fire for a few moments. But even the fire could not fully defeat the winter cold. The kitchen was simply too large, the ceiling too high, the walls too thick and unyielding. At night, when the fire was banked and the cooking done, the temperature would drop precipitously. Frost would form on the inside of the windows. Water in buckets would develop a skin of ice. Sleeping near the fire was the only way to stay warm. But even then, you would wake shivering, pulling your blanket tighter, trying to burrow into whatever straw or rags you had gathered for bedding. Illness was a constant companion in medieval kitchens, especially in winter. The combination of cold, smoke, poor hygiene, and exhaustion created ideal conditions for sickness. Coughs were ubiquitous. The smoke irritated lungs and throats. And once a cough took hold, it rarely left until spring. Servants would hack and wheeze as they worked, pausing to spit into the fire or onto the floor. Consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, was common and fatal. It spread easily in close quarters. And once someone had it, there was nothing to be done but wait for the inevitable. Fevers came and went. Some were minor and passed quickly. Others were more serious, leaving servants bedridden for days or even weeks. If a servant could not work, they were not paid. And in a world without savings or safety nets, this was disastrous. Many worked through illness, pushing themselves until they collapsed. Cuts and burns were daily occurrences in the kitchen. Knives were sharp when they were new, though they quickly dulled and required sharpening. A moment of inattention could result in a deep cut, and in the dirty conditions of the kitchen, cuts easily became infected. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria. Infections were treated with poultices made from herbs, with prayers, with hope. Often, they got worse rather than better. Burns from the fire or from hot pots were even more common. A splash of boiling water or fat could cause serious burns, leaving skin red and blistered. These too often became infected. A bad burn could end a servant's career, leaving them unable to work and therefore unable to eat. Stomach ailments were frequent as well. Food spoilage was difficult to detect in the dim light of the kitchen. Meat that had gone bad, vegetables that had rotted, ale that had soured. All of these could cause illness, sometimes mild, sometimes severe. Dysentery was not uncommon, and it was particularly dangerous in winter when cold and dehydration could be fatal. The kitchen also attracted pests beyond rats. Fleas and lice lived in clothing and bedding, biting constantly. There was no effective way to get rid of them. You simply endured the itching, the scratching that left your skin raw and sometimes infected. Despite all of this, or perhaps because of it, kitchen servants developed a kind of grim resilience. They learned to ignore minor pain, to work through discomfort, to accept that their bodies would be used hard and would wear out early. The average life expectancy for a person in medieval times was not high to begin with, and for those in demanding physical work, it was even lower. Discipline in the kitchen was harsh and immediate. The head cook had the authority to punish servants who worked too slowly, who made mistakes, who showed disrespect. Punishments ranged from verbal abuse, which was constant, to physical punishment. A servant who broke a pot or ruined a dish might be struck. A slap, a shove, a blow with whatever was handy. Kitchen implements doubled as weapons when needed. A heavy wooden spoon could leave a bruise. A metal ladle could do worse. More serious offences could result in being beaten more thoroughly or in having food withheld. In winter, when everyone was hungry and rations were tight, missing a meal was a genuine hardship. The worst punishment was to be dismissed. Without a position, you had no income, no shelter, no food. In winter, this could be a death sentence. Servants who were dismissed would beg to be taken back, promising to do better, to work harder. Sometimes they were given another chance. Often they were not. The hierarchy in the kitchen replicated the hierarchy of the larger society. Those at the bottom had no rights, no recourse, no protection. They worked because they had no other choice. They endured abuse because the alternative was starvation. And yet, despite all of this, there were moments of something resembling community. Servants who worked side by side every day, who shared the same hardships, sometimes formed bonds. A kind word, a shared piece of bread, a moment of humor in the midst of exhaustion. These small gestures mattered. The kitchen, for all its misery, was also a place where life continued, where food was made and shared, where the fundamental human need to eat was met, day after day, even in the darkest months of winter. As winter progressed, supplies inevitably dwindled. The salted meat ran low. The stored vegetables began to rot faster than they could be used. Grain stores were carefully watched, measured out each day to make them last until spring. In a bad year, when the harvest had been poor or when winter lasted longer than expected, rationing became severe. Pottage became thinner. Bread portions shrank. The meat that went into the nobles' meals was stretched with more vegetables and grain. For the servants, meals became minimal. A bowl of thin pottage twice a day, a piece of hard bread, perhaps some ale, though even that might be rationed if the supplies were running low. Hunger was not unusual in medieval times, but winter hunger was particularly cruel. Your body needed more food in cold weather to maintain warmth, but food was scarce precisely when you needed it most. Servants would grow thin, their clothes hanging loose on their frames. Their movements would slow. Their thoughts would become sluggish. Hunger was not just an empty stomach. It was exhaustion, weakness, an inability to concentrate or to care about anything beyond the next meal. Some would try to steal food, slipping a piece of bread or a handful of grain when they thought no one was looking. If they were caught, the punishment was severe. But hunger could make people desperate. In the worst winters, people died. Not always dramatically, not always immediately. They simply grew weaker and sicker until one day they did not wake up. Starvation, complicated by cold and illness. These deaths were often recorded without much comment. A servant's name might be noted in a household account, along with a notation that they had died and would need to be replaced. Life went on. Another servant would be hired, usually someone equally desperate, equally without options. The castle's food stores belonged to the lord. They were his property. acquired through rents and tithes from the peasants who worked his land. In a hard year, the Lord might choose to reduce his own consumption to make the stores last longer. More often, the burden fell on those at the bottom of the hierarchy. This was not seen as unfair exactly. It was simply the natural order of things. The Lord had privileges and responsibilities. The servants had duties and obligations. Survival was never guaranteed, and no one expected it to be. Spring, when it finally came, was not a sudden transformation. The cold lingered for weeks after the official end of winter. Snow might fall in early spring, covering the new growth. Frost could still damage the first tender shoots of plants. But gradually, day by day, things changed. The days grew longer. The sun rose higher in the sky and carried real warmth. The ice on the well melted. The stored food, meager as it was by this point, only had to last a little longer. The kitchen remained busy, perhaps busier than ever. Spring was a time of renewal, but also a time of preparation. Animals that had survived the winter needed to be tended. Gardens needed to be planted. Repairs that had been postponed during the cold months needed to be made. For the kitchen servants, spring meant fresh food would eventually return. Young greens, the first of the spring vegetables, eggs from chickens that began laying again. Fresh milk from cows and goats that had survived the winter. It meant an end to the relentless sameness of winter meals. An end to the constant struggle to make spoiled food edible. An end to the bone, deep cold that had defined every moment of the past months. But it also meant another winter would come eventually. That the cycle would repeat. That next year they would face the same challenges, the same hardships, the same test of endurance. Medieval people did not think much about the future in the way we do now. Their lives were focused on survival, on making it through each day, each season, each year. The kitchen, for all its misery, was the place that made survival possible. It was where food was transformed from raw ingredients into meals, where the work of dozens of people came together to keep the household fed. The tools of the medieval kitchen were simple and few. Knives, sometimes well made, often not. Large iron pots, heavy and difficult to clean. Wooden spoons and ladles. Mortars and pestles for grinding spices and herbs. Trivets to hold pots above the fire. Hooks and chains to hang pots from the chimney. Everything was used until it wore out completely. Pots were patched and repatched. Spoons were carved from wood when metal ones broke. Knives were sharpened until the blade was narrow and weak, then discarded and replaced with whatever could be found or afforded. There were no thermometers, no timers, no measuring cups. Cooking was done by experience and instinct. You learned to judge temperature by how close you could hold your hand to the pot. You learned timing by feel and by watching. You learned quantities by eye and by memory. This made training new servants difficult. There was no manual to consult, no written recipes in most households. Knowledge was passed from one person to another through observation and practice. You watched the experienced cook. You tried to copy what they did. You made mistakes and learned from them. Some monasteries and wealthy households kept recipe collections, but these were rare and precious. Most were written in Latin or French, languages that ordinary servants could not read, even if they had access to the books, which they did not. Recipes, when they existed in written form, were often vague by modern standards. Take enough flour or cook until done were typical instructions. Exact measurements and precise temperatures were not part of medieval cooking. The social dynamics of the kitchen were complex. On one hand, everyone in the kitchen was a servant, part of the lower ranks of castle society. On the other hand, there were clear divisions within that group. The head cook had authority and a degree of respect. They might eat slightly better food, sleep in a slightly better place. They had the ear of the steward or even, occasionally, the lord. The assistant cooks and specialists occupied a middle ground. They had skills and therefore some value. They were less easily replaced than the lowest servants. The scullions had nothing, no skills that were valued, no leverage, no prospects. They were there because they were young and desperate and had nowhere else to go. Some would eventually work their way up, learning enough to become assistant cooks themselves. Many would not. Gender roles in the kitchen varied depending on the size and type of household. In smaller castles, women did much of the cooking, as they did in peasant households. In larger castles, the head cook was often a man, and men dominated the higher positions. But women still did much of the actual work, particularly the tedious, repetitive tasks, like plucking birds, shelling peas, and scrubbing pots. There was often tension between male and female servants. Men generally had more authority and better prospects. Women were paid less for the same work, if they were paid at all. Some worked only for food and shelter. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, alliances formed. A young scullion might be taken under the wing of an older servant who taught them skills and protected them from the worst of the abuse. Friendships developed, though they were often fragile and dependent on circumstances. Romance happened, though it was generally discouraged. Servants who married might be dismissed, as married women were expected to leave service. Pregnancies were disasters, ending careers and often lives. There were ways to prevent or end pregnancies. Knowledge passed quietly among women, but these methods were unreliable and dangerous. The kitchen was a microcosm of medieval society. Hierarchy, hardship, small kindnesses, and large cruelties all existed side by side. The year turned, as it always did. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn. The harvest came again, and the work of preserving food for the next winter began again. The kitchen servants who survived one winter would face another, and another, until age or illness or accident ended their service. There was no retirement, no pension, no comfortable old age for most medieval people, and certainly not for servants. When you could no longer work, you depended on charity, on family if you had any, on luck. Some castles had a tradition of keeping old servants on in reduced roles, giving them light tasks and enough food to live on. This was kindness, but it was also rare. Most lords could not afford to feed people who no longer contributed. The lucky ones died quickly. An accident, a sudden illness. The unlucky ones declined slowly, their bodies failing piece by piece, their usefulness diminishing until they were turned out or left to die. Seems cruel by modern standards, and it was. But medieval life was cruel in ways we struggle to imagine now. The margin between survival and death was narrow. Resources were limited. Compassion, while it existed, was a luxury that many could not afford. The kitchen, despite everything, was where life was sustained. Not just in the abstract sense of preparing food, but in the very practical sense of taking raw, often unappetizing ingredients, and turning them into something that people could eat and that would keep them alive for another day. The servants who worked there, anonymous to history for the most part, were essential. Without them, the grand feasts of the nobles would not have happened. The elaborate meals, the displays of wealth and power, all depended on the labor of people whose names we will never know. The stories that have come down to us from medieval times focus on the nobility, on the knights and ladies, the battles and the politics. The kitchen is rarely mentioned. When it is, it's usually in passing, a detail in a larger narrative. But the kitchen was where much of real life happened, where people worked and suffered and occasionally found small joys, where the everyday business of survival was carried out, day after day, season after season, year after year. We can reconstruct some of what kitchen life was like from various sources. Account books that list purchases and supplies, architectural remains of castle kitchens, occasional descriptions in chronicles or letters, archaeological evidence of food waste and cooking implements. But much is lost. The day-to-day experiences, the conversations, the relationships, the small dramas that filled the hours. These were not considered worth recording, and so they vanished with the people who lived them. What we can say with certainty is that medieval kitchens in winter were places of hardship. The cold, the smoke, the darkness, the exhaustion, the constant work and inadequate food, the hierarchy and the discipline. And yet, they were also places of necessity, of human ingenuity in the face of limitation, of the fundamental human drive to feed ourselves and each other, to keep going despite everything. The fire in the hearth burns on through the night, though it has been banked and is now mostly embers. A scullion sleeps nearby, wrapped in a thin blanket, too tired to be bothered by the hardness of the floor. Morning will come soon enough, though it is still hours away. The same routine will begin again. The fire will be rebuilt. The first meal will be prepared. The endless cycle of work will continue. Outside, snow falls silently in the dark. It will be there in the morning, covering the courtyard, adding another layer of cold to an already frozen world. But in the kitchen, the embers glow. Heat radiates outward, not enough to warm the whole room, but enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. This is what survival looked like in a medieval winter. Not heroic, not grand, just the simple, difficult business of making it through to morning, and then to the next morning, and the one after that. The kitchen will wake before dawn, as it always does. The work will begin again, as it always does. And somewhere in the cold, dark hours before sunrise, another winter day will start, much like all the others. This was a medieval life. This was how people lived, how they endured, how they carried on despite hardship that would break most of us now. And slowly, so slowly you could barely notice, the days would begin to lengthen. Winter would loosen its grip. Spring would come eventually. But tonight, in the depths of winter, in the quiet hours when even the rats have settled, and the only sound is the soft hiss of embers and the breathing of sleeping servants, the kitchen rests. Tomorrow will be hard, but that's a problem for tomorrow. For now, there's only this moment. The dying fire, the cold pressing in, the weight of exhaustion, and the knowledge that morning will come, and with it, all the work that must be done. Sleep, when it comes, is deep and dreamless. The sleep of the thoroughly exhausted. The sleep that is not quite enough, but will have to be. And when morning comes, when the scullion wakes and reaches for the kindling and begins the process of rebuilding the fire, it will start again. The medieval kitchen in winter, a place of hardship and survival, a place we can barely imagine now, from our world of central heating and grocery stores and easy abundance. But it was real. For hundreds of years, this was how people lived, how they worked, how they survived. And in the end, they did survive. Generation after generation, through winters that seemed endless, through hunger and cold and exhaustion. They kept the fires burning and the food coming, and life went on. We've spent these hours together in a medieval kitchen, walking through the dark months when survival was not guaranteed, and comfort was a distant concept. It's a world that feels impossibly far from our own. A world where warmth was scarce, food was monotonous, and work was relentless. Where servants stood in smoky rooms for 16 hours a day, where children turned spits until their arms ached, where everyone went to bed hungry and woke up cold. But it was also a world where people endured, where they found ways to carry on despite everything, where the simple act of preparing a meal became an act of resistance against the winter and the darkness and the cold. The medieval kitchen was not romantic. It was not the cozy, warm place we imagine when we think of old-fashioned cooking. It was hard and dirty and often cruel. But it was also where life was sustained, where the work got done, where people, most of them unnamed in history, kept going through the worst that winter could bring. And eventually, as it always did, spring came. The cold retreated, fresh food returned, and the people who had survived another winter could rest for a moment before the cycle began again. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to a story that has no heroes, no great events, just the everyday struggle of ordinary people trying to make it through another winter. If you found this interesting, consider liking the video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next. For now, though, rest. You've earned it. The medieval kitchen can wait. Winter can wait. Sleep well.